The New Deal. In this video, we will examine the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the New Deal, and the cultural expressions of the Great Depression. The nation's problems. Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in March 1933, at the height of the Depression, inheriting a series of social and economic problems. Unemployment was the most serious challenge. 1/4 of the nation's labor force had lost their jobs and had no prospect of getting a new one. Local relief agencies were overwhelmed. Social tensions were mounting, and many feared a revolution. The gross national product continued to decrease, and industrial production was down to half the 1929 levels. Many businesses went bankrupt in the years following the crash. Bank runs became frequent, and the banking system was on the verge of collapse. During bank runs, customers attempted to withdraw all of their deposits at once. All of their money, of course, was not available for withdrawal, since the bank had invested most of it. This created further financial panic and threatened to topple the banking system. Additionally, Americans could no longer afford mortgage payments on their homes or farms and faced foreclosure, with the banks seizing and auctioning their properties. Besides the economic crisis, the Great Plains faced a major environmental disaster, the Dust Bowl. Farmers had removed the tough grasses that protected the soil, and the soil turned into dust after a series of droughts in the 1930s. The strong winds took the dust east, damaging crops and choking farmers and livestock. Many farmers simply abandoned their farms and moved to California. These farmers were popularly known as Okies, since most of them were from Oklahoma. In California, conditions were also challenging, and the Okies were generally distrusted and often had difficulty finding work. The Roosevelt Presidency. Franklin D. Roosevelt came from a wealthy New York family and was related to former President Theodore Roosevelt. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was also related to the former president and played a critical role in his political career and his personal life. In 1921, Franklin Roosevelt was struck by polio, a crippling disease that left him completely paralyzed. Eleanor aided her husband's rehabilitation so that he could stand with the help of metal braces. She took an active role as an advisor as FDR resumed his political career, first serving as New York's governor and then as he took office as president in 1933. Roosevelt was an excellent speaker and an effective communicator. As president, he took advantage of the new technologies and used radio broadcasts and motion pictures to reach the American public, filling them with confidence and hope. In his famous fireside chats, he addressed millions of American radio listeners to explain his policies in simple terms, with a message of optimism and unity. To carry out his New Deal plan, Roosevelt assembled a team of experts as advisors and created a number of agencies to implement policies. Agencies were generally known by acronyms, and there were so many, in fact, that Americans began to refer to them as the alphabet soup. The first New Deal. The New Deal was an ambitious project in terms of size and scope. In its first wave, Roosevelt wanted to implement measures to deal with 3 specific goals: relief, recovery, and reform. With help from Congress, Roosevelt passed legislation quickly and started the first New Deal, which lasted from 1933 to 1935. Relief. To deal with poverty and unemployment, Roosevelt favored work relief through government projects that gave people work, while at the same time improving the nation's infrastructure. The Federal Emergency Relief Act of 1933 granted funds to state and local governments for emergency relief and to hire millions of people for work projects. Young men found opportunities in the Civilian Conservation Corps, with outdoor jobs such as planting trees or draining swamps. These young men were housed in camps supervised by Army officers and received free uniforms and meals. Most of the money they received was to be sent home to their families. Two other programs, the Public Works Administration and the Civil Works Administration, focused on building infrastructure and public facilities, such as bridges, highways, hospitals, airports, and courthouses, among other facilities. Homeowners facing foreclosure had access to most needed emergency loans at low interest rates from the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Farmers who had been hard hit by the Depression were also receiving similar loans, thanks to the Agriculture Adjustment Act of 1933. The South had been especially devastated by the Depression. Many areas still lacked infrastructure, electricity, running water, and significant industry. For that reason, the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, targeted the Tennessee Valley region, one of the most impoverished and least developed areas in the country. The TVA built and maintained dams, which controlled floods and provided electricity. Even though government ownership of the project remained controversial, the project was successful in bringing prosperity to the region. Recovery. To recover industrial production, the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 set up the NRA, or the National Recovery Administration, with the purpose of stabilizing prices and reducing wasteful competition. The NRA directed companies within an industry to draft codes of fair practice, setting up standard prices, limiting production, reducing the work week to 40 hours, and establishing a minimum wage. About 95% of all industries joined the NRA and proudly displayed to customers their NRA membership poster. Cooperation was generally encouraged, and antitrust restrictions and price-fixing legislation were largely ignored. In 1935, the Supreme Court declared the act unconstitutional, on the grounds that the federal government had no power to intervene in business conducted within a state. To deal with the difficult situation of farmers, Congress passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933, which sought to stabilize prices by eliminating agricultural surpluses. The federal government was paying farmers to plant fewer acres and to kill excess livestock. Again, this was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court on the same grounds: federal intervention in the economic activities of one state. Congress then passed a second Agricultural Adjustment Act in 1938. In this one, the federal government limited agricultural production and gave farmers a set number of acres to plant. Surpluses were stored by the government, while farmers received loans and training on conservation and improvement of soil fertility. Reform. The financial and banking sectors needed urgent reform. and Roosevelt acted quickly in that regard. Right after inauguration, a bank holiday was declared. All of the nation's banks were closed and were not allowed to open until the government inspected all of their records and declared them financially sound. This greatly eliminated bank runs. The federal government also offered help to banks in danger by extending emergency funds and assistance. Roosevelt used his fireside chats to convince Americans to deposit their money back and reopen their bank accounts. To further this goal, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, was created in 1933. Under the FDIC, bank account deposits were insured by the federal government, up to a certain amount, in case of bank failures. The Securities and Exchange Commission was set up in 1934 to prevent the financial conditions that generated the Great Depression in the first place. Under the SEC, operations in the stock market were regulated, and companies selling securities were required to provide accurate information to investors. The Second New Deal. After many of Roosevelt's first New Deal programs were struck down by the Supreme Court, a second New Deal began in 1935, seeking to expand opportunities for Americans, set up a social security system, and introduce labor reform. The Work Progress Administration, WPA, was set up in 1935 to increase employment by spending $11 billion on public works projects such as schools, courthouses, roads, and bridges. The WPA also hired artists, architects, writers, and musicians, greatly encouraging the arts during this difficult period. The major cause of suffering during the Great Depression was the lack of a safety net to fall back on in times of illness, unemployment, or a death in the family. The Social Security Act of 1935 became the most important piece of legislation passed during this time. It still protects many Americans. Social Security benefits include unemployment insurance, retirement benefits, which include monthly payments after retirement, and payments to spouses and children in case of untimely death, as well as grants to disabled and orphan Americans. This program is paid with a special payroll tax. As far as labor reform, Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, commonly known as the Wagner Act, which again guaranteed workers' rights to unionize and submit grievances to the National Labor Relations Board. This legislation prevented employers from engaging in anti-union practices. In 1936, there was a sit-down strike at the General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan. Workers occupied the plant, prevented the owners from using it. The federal government didn't intervene to stop the strike, and General Motors eventually recognized the Automobile Workers Union. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed, prohibiting children from working in factories and setting a minimum wage and a maximum number of working hours. Popular culture of the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, the talkies, or films with sound, became popular, and movies such as Gone with the Wind or The Wizard of Oz were the favorites of those trying to escape reality for a while. Comic strips, music variety shows, and the first Mickey Mouse cartoons added to the escapism of the 1930s. John Steinbeck is perhaps the author that best captured the plight of the Okies and their struggles as they moved to California. His most famous work, Grapes of Wrath, tells the story of the Jodes family as they moved from Oklahoma to California. Another important expression of this era was photography. Dorothea Lange, who worked for the Farm Security Administration, photographed people afflicted by poverty during the Depression. Her photographs became iconic and prompted calls for relief. The end of the New Deal. After the New Deal, Roosevelt enjoyed great popularity and was re-elected in 1936, and then again in 1940 and 1944. He succeeded in creating a strong democratic coalition that included workers, the poor, African Americans, other minorities, and the traditional Democratic Solid South. Even though the New Deal didn't end the Great Depression, it did improve the economic situation and made the economy stronger. Roosevelt feared that the Supreme Court would once more strike down New Deal legislation and proposed Congress to allow him to pack the court by naming 6 new justices, one for every justice over the age of 70. The American public and Congress rejected the plan. But 2 justices did switch their votes and kept the New Deal going. In 1936, Roosevelt attempted to reduce government spending, but as the economy suffered, he had to resume federal spending. At the end, the New Deal succeeded in reducing unemployment, improving the nation's infrastructure, creating a safety net, and introducing legislation to reform banking, securities, and labor relations. At the same time, the national debt increased, along with taxes and the size of the government. The United States would only reach full employment as it was preparing to enter the worst war in human history, World War II. In the next videos, we will examine in detail the causes, course, and consequences of World War II.